Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here again. The topic of this year's Free Market Roadshow is freedom in Europe 30 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And when I was looking at this topic, I discovered that I had now lived half of my life before and after the fall of the curtain. Before it was, we thought it would stay forever, and we're very glad it is gone. This is my fourth or fifth time to Moldova. I started out my career in banking, covering Eastern Europe for an American bank, and was always fascinated by the way that the economies worked despite the communist and planned economic background in these countries. I mean, you know that my great-uncle Friedrich von Hayek wrote the book, The Road to Serfdom, where he warns of the dangers of transitioning from a free market economy to a planned economy and what that will lead to. Obviously, here you have the opposite effect. You are transitioning from planned economies to open markets, and well, on top of that, Moldova obviously has quite a few other problems because of the border situation between two blocks. As well as, I'm also very glad that there are so many young people here, because we are, of course, aware of the problems that the large number of Moldovans that have immigrated and are not here pose to the country, the brain drain that has gone on. But now I have to transition to the topic of international property. I don't know if you have seen that Hayek's Nobel Prize and quite a few of his books were auctioned off at Sotheby's last week. And my cousins, his grandchildren, made a bit of money, and they're actually still getting royalties from all of these books that he wrote, so they're well off. But if you have any questions in that regard, I'll be glad to answer them. But as we said, today's topic, intellectual property, and I think Barbara is going to kick off in another role today.
Yeah, well,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I would like to divide the panel into more or less a little bit of academic background and facts and figures, and why IP and property rights matter. And then I would like to hand over to my dear friend Cyntia Ortiz Toledo from the industry, from JTI, who actually will give you some practical examples of why it matters that we have a close look at the protection of property rights, and to Jared Parks, who is from the US Chamber of Commerce, and he is in charge of the IP department there, and he will give you a broader overview or overlook. I mean, we as Europeans take it for granted, actually, that we protect our property rights, especially in those countries that are rooted with the Roman law. And because, as you all know, there is the property right, things that you have, that you own, that you have the property of, that need to be protected. And then there is the other part in the Roman language, the rem sibi habendi, the things that you just borrow or just you pay rent for, etc. So those are the two things that we always need to keep in mind. There's a huge difference between possessing things, owning things, and then just owning them as, you know, I borrow it from somebody, but I pay for it. So this is the basic thing. Then the next step that we need to look into from an academic perspective, and especially from a libertarian perspective, is that the protection of the property rights, of physical property rights, you know, like buildings, like cars, anything like cell phones, but also the places that we build our houses on, that all those things are in many places registered and that are kind of protected by the government. And here comes in the big debate. Do we have this protection done by governments, or can it be also done privately? I just give you the idea of blockchain. And this is something where we look into new ideas of protection, where sometimes governments don't need to do the work because it can be done in a different way. So as we know, we are in transition, in a technological transition, and certain things that have worked for hundreds of years are now put into question. And there are pro-market people, libertarians, who definitely say, no, we don't need the government to protect our property. We can do it either ourselves or the market simply will solve the problem. So you have the one side and the other side, the typical economic side that we argue. This is one thing. The second thing, where we also, or many libertarians disagree on, is the patent issue. With patents, that is, and actually Richard wanted to discuss that as an introduction. He, however, forget, but we can do this in the break or in the afternoon as well. There is laws, or actually protection coordinated with it, that patents are taken for a certain number of years. It depends on which legal system you are and what kind of patents it is. But again, if you invent something, you patent it, and it is protected by institutions. So do we want this? Yes or no? And I will give you an example with medicine. We have had debates on pharmaceuticals, for example, where certain institutions say you have to give away the patent because we want that certain medication can be produced much cheaper because you don't own this patent. You should not own this patent. However, anything that is related with property rights is you have to keep in mind that you invest into something. If you create something, this doesn't come from nothing. You create something, you produce something, you invest into research and development, and all those things cost a lot of money. Jared will go into more depth how much money is invested there. So these are the two challenges that we as pro-market people, as libertarians, have to look at. However, and my perspective is I'm a totally pro-protection of property rights because I think it is something that should stick with the rule of law, the basic principles that go together. And I will give you just some, before I hand over to Cynthia and then to Jared, just some important ideas and numbers. Why it is important and why it is also important that it is transparent, and why the protection of the rule of law and property rights is the foundation of our prosperous society. Because without the proper infrastructure to ensure democratic governance and property, we could not function. Our economies would not work because it's the trust that you have to have in a certain transaction, in an exchange that makes investors invest. And if they don't invest, we're screwed, as you all know. As a result, individuals are less likely to create and develop IP if you do not protect them. So IP rights are vital to economic competitiveness as well. And competition, as you all know, and this is what Hayek and many other of the Austrian economists have taught us, is a precondition to create, to innovate. And as you all know, the process of the creation of knowledge, the knowledge creation process is from one individual to the next, and then this entire chain works out. What is also important is, and I just give you some facts and figures, that from the United States and the European Union, IP incentive industries have supported tens of millions of jobs and contribute trillions of dollars to the annual GDP of both continents. For example, in the EU, IP incentive jobs contribute 26% of employment and 39% of the GDP. And countries, and you will see that from Jared later, and I will stop now, countries that have a strong IP protection have up to 13 times higher GDP than those who do not. So again, the protection of IP rights and of property in general is important, otherwise you're lost. And just give you one last sentence. If you look at what happened 50 years ago in Singapore, and we're not covering we're not discussing the democratic issue now, but what Lee Kuan Yew back then did, he made sure that the property rights are secured, that those who invest in this, back then it was a swamp, in this place can rely on the rule of law, that things that they invest in are not being taken away by them. So this is why why countries grow and why investment needs to have a trustworthy environment. Without further ado, I just simply hand over to Cynthia, and who will cover the floor on a very practical way. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here with so many bright minds together in one room. Personally, I believe that the value of ideas is most likely the most valuable asset we can ever possess. The importance of intellectual property and the value of ideas, as Barbara was mentioning a couple of minutes ago, it is relevant not only for individuals, but for society as well. We know the importance of having creators, innovators, having the rights and the ownership of their ideas protected. And also how this reflects on the importance of society development as well. We know that IP-intensive countries are developing better and faster than others are not. And of course, and I think Jared will talk later based on these different IP indexes that we have so far, measuring this development as well. So the importance of intellectual property, it's enormous, and we all have that quite clear. But I want to focus on one specific point of intellectual property today, which are trademarks or brands. Why are they so important, brands? So I think it comes from a two standpoint. The first one is from a consumer perspective. Consumers need brands because they have the reassurance that a manufacturer stands behind the products and the brands. It also gives them confidence to know that they are buying a legitimate product and protects them against counterfeit products. It also helps them to navigate well and have informed choices, know what are they purchasing. And from a business standpoint, of course we know companies invest very, very heavily on their brands and trademarks, and I think it is arguably the most valuable asset any company could have. The reason for this is clearly because they want to create brand loyalty. And the reason for this is if you create brand loyalty, well, of course, this will increase, of course, your revenues. So it's a clear importance from a business standpoint as well. So the focus of my presentation today, it is not so much about the theory about importance of IP, but more what happens in reality when these rights are not protected as they should, or as a result of regulation, they turn out to be actually infringed. Let's go back 1 second and understand why governments regulate. I'm not going to go so much into the theory. I know I have much better economists discussing this. I'm just a lawyer, so I don't know the economic theory so much. But what I do know is that the idea of regulation is that the governments intervene to correct market failure. But the problem is when this market failure doesn't really exist, or that intervention is not really necessary, what happens then? Then they create government failure and actually leads to the misallocation of resources. What happens then as well is that sometimes when governments aim to regulate, they don't clearly analyze the objectives of that regulation. They don't necessarily understand how clearly and measurably these objectives could be achieved. So from the onset, this regulation is flawed. And then it goes ahead, if they don't have a detailed discipline of how to regulate, if they don't do a proper cost-benefit analysis, if the regulation itself is going to cost more than the benefits that it imposes. So you have some rules to follow and consider when you are regulating. And one important one as well that regulators often miss to take the point is to consider other alternatives, most likely non-regulatory alternatives, besides just introducing regulation. In the past, before joining JTI, I used to work in the Mexican government as an oversight body of regulators. And I can tell you they didn't like us really at all because they didn't want to have someone asking them to actually analyze why are you regulating and scrutinizing the reasons for regulation. So when this discipline doesn't exist, we create some failures. But to make it worse, what happens sometimes is that the frustration of regulators when they don't achieve the public objectives that they aim to do, instead of going back one point and assessing why it didn't work, they just think of, okay, maybe I need more stringent regulation, let's regulate more. So that doesn't work either, and then go more, another layer of regulation. And then that doesn't work either, they still don't achieve what they want, and then you add another layer of regulation. So this layering of regulation makes it almost impossible to assess the effectiveness of the policy objective they aim to achieve in the beginning. I have a very concrete example about this layering of regulation, which I want to show you today, and it's related to tobacco products. As you know, the tobacco industry is one of the most regulated industries so far. We have a debate a little bit with finance and banking because they claim they're more regulated than us, and we are always debating who is more, but anyway. What we know is that there has been a global trend of increasing regulation of the industry, and there has been from increasing health warnings, taxation, restrictions at point of sale, etc. But I want to focus on one today, which is the one that led to the so-called plain packaging of tobacco. And before going into what actually this policy is, I just want to go actually how we see a clear example of layering here. So, what happened with the tobacco industry? One specific aspect. So they faced the objective of reducing smoking prevalence. Okay? First initiative, restrict advertising. Let's limit the time of advertising, the hours, the venues, etc. That didn't achieve the objective they were looking for. Let's ban advertising. Let's ban it altogether. No more advertising at all. But then that didn't achieve either the objective they wanted. And you have to give it to them. Regulators were very creative on this because then they start looking, since they pretty much banned everything else, what else they could do. So they imagined that packaging constitutes advertising. So if you make advertising, and advertising is already banned anyway, then the next thing you know, let's ban packaging. Let's ban the use of trademarks and brands. And that is what mandates plain packaging. So for those of you who haven't heard about plain packaging, plain packaging looks like this. Basically, these are the packs that are sold now in UK and France and Australia since 2012, and we have as well in New Zealand, we have as well in Norway and in Ireland. What happened here, as you can see, this is effectively a ban on branding. Brands are no longer allowed. Colors are no longer allowed. What only you can use is a designed, determined color, this green color they have chosen, because they did some research actually to find the most ugly color they could actually find, and it's turned out to be this one. And then they also remove any kind of use of trademark, logos, non-prescribed colors, everything is banned. You can still use your brand name, but in the standardized font as well. So, what was the reason for this? Let's look at the objectives that I'm sorry, this is like this. Yes. The objectives of plain packaging. So the idea was to prevent smoking initiation, then reduce the smoking prevalence, to reduce this impulse purchase that you have when you see a pack and you have this immediate urge to buy the product because you just saw it, to reduce the amount of minors consuming it, being mindful that it's an illegal product for minors, it's destined for adults only, and also to avoid this misleading capacity that packs could have and these colors could have on attracting consumers. So also they thought, well, at the same time we're doing this, many of them, they also increase the size of the health warnings to cover most of the pack and also to make them more noticeable. So what happened in reality is that this is so weird, I'm sorry. The results were not there. Basically, the aim of this, and we know it very well from Australia, which started in 2012, so it's already more than 6 years that it's in place. Australia is a very interesting example because they have tried pretty much everything. They have all the different regulations that they could put in place, and they already had a declining trend on smoking prevalence. The interesting thing is after introduction of plain packaging, this long-term declining trend actually stopped. So they were actually succeeding. They were also introducing other measures at the same time of plain packaging, and respective of that, the results are just not there. And in France and the UK, despite our more recent, we are still seeing some similar results. The impact on consumption hasn't really changed. So the problem here is, it's not only that this policy is not working, it's not achieving the objectives that they aim to have, but we mentioned a bit earlier the importance of having a cost-benefit analysis, how much benefit we get from this policy and how much it's going to cost. And part of these costs are the negative consequences that this policy has. So what happens when you no longer have brands? What happens is that price becomes a key differentiator in this equation. People don't buy the product because they don't have brand loyalty anymore. In the long term, brand loyalty actually will erode. What makes a difference here, it's the price. So what it happens is that consumers start downtrading, choosing products that are cheaper alternatives. So they go from premium purchasing to value purchasing. But it doesn't stop there, because what is the cheapest thing you can actually find? It's illegal. Those products are the cheapest ones, they don't pay taxes, they are cheap. And in a plain packaging environment, when all the packs look the same, and you no longer have these brand features that protect you from counterfeiting products, these packs are actually easy to copy. So the results we saw, of course, first is the downtrading, which is causing also loss of tax revenue for governments. Be mindful that in many countries, it's almost 80% of the price of tobacco. But then not only that, it is also facilitating illegal trade. And we have good examples of this. In Australia, for example, again, independent research from KPMG start analyzing how these trends have moved in Australia, and they found that actually it has grown up to 15% of consumption in 2017, historical amounts of illegal trade there. Same thing goes with France. It tripled in 2018 compared to data from 2017. And from the initial information we have from the UK, it's a similar result. Of course, as I was mentioning, this also impacts that revenue, and it's about of 1.46 billion in 2017 for Australia. So we're talking of big numbers here, and big numbers as well, because the unfortunate thing is that all this illegal tobacco, normally this money goes to criminal hands. So the groups that are behind it, and we know we have information about it, end up with criminal groups, many of them actually funding terrorism. So it is actually a very serious situation. So the problem is, how could this have been avoided? How can governments, if they decide to intervene through regulation, can do it properly, can do it well? So we know that there are many organizations, such as the OECD and the World Bank and many others, that are coming with some ideas on how the regulations should be effectively done. There should be a discipline when you produce regulations. And these include public consultations from the people that are actually living this industry and know about it, but also the general public that have a say. So they should consult and get this information and data from the affected sectors and public in general. But they also need to do a proper cost-benefit analysis, a regulatory impact assessment. What is this going to cost? What are the benefits that are going to come from this? And if you do it, you have a clear standpoint of what actually is going to happen, and you can actually anticipate all these negative consequences. They should be coming into that equation. And finally is the ex-post analysis. They should analyze, once the regulation is in place, couple of years after, take a step back and look into the regulation. Is it actually achieving something? Is it achieving the objective they want to achieve? Is it actually working? Otherwise, you end up with huge layers of regulation. We know governments are trying to reduce, or calling at least to reduce the red tape, is that all these burden that regulations are imposed upon citizens and the industry, it should be cut down. But the thing is, if you don't properly do regulations, it doesn't make that result. So what we know is that better regulation principles could actually achieve these ideas. If you have this discipline, you can promote high quality regulation that actually will be consistent and will encourage innovation, not deter it, and it will be compatible with competition and trade and investment. That will also make sure that regulation is fit for purpose and it is in the public interest. And most importantly, it will limit the burden that it creates on industries. It is unfair to have regulations that are not achieving the objective they claim to have, but at the same time impose a huge cost on the industry. In our case, as the tobacco industry, it implied for us losing our brands, losing the rights to our intellectual property. So it is an important situation. And I think one last point I want to mention is that this is not a policy that is just limited to the tobacco industry. We have seen many interesting points about how similar initiatives are going through other different industry sectors. Obviously, the ones that are most affected in the immediate sense is the alcohol industry, it's the sugary drinks, and there's this call to actually apply tobacco-style regulation to these industries as well. But it could go even more than that. We've seen examples also of plain packaging calls for baby formula, for example, for infant formula, because they also claim that packagings are attractive and therefore we should eliminate the use of packaging, more or less the same logic. So the thing that is important to know here is that once you infringe for one industry sector their intellectual property, these restrictions open the door for applying it to other industry sectors as well, which is very dangerous in the end. Because if one industry loses their intellectual property, pretty much all brand owners will lose. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Parks. I'm here from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's a pleasure to be here. I've never been to Moldova before, so forgive me if I also use English. For those of you who aren't familiar with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in the U.S., chambers of commerce are usually a little bit different than they are here in Europe. It's not part of the U.S. government in any way. It's fully a private sector organization, and it's essentially a business advocacy group. We're the largest business advocacy organization in the world, representing a little over 3 million individual businesses of all shapes and sizes across all different industry sectors, many of them in the U.S., but also global businesses around the world, including many here in Europe. Within the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I work in a division known as the Global IP Center, and it's a collection of diverse industries that have a common reliance on intellectual property rights. Much of the facts and figures that I was going to give you have already been used by my colleagues, so I'll keep this brief because I know we're a little behind schedule. But in the U.S., we view intellectual property as a fundamental property right, enshrined in our Constitution by our founding fathers, who actually took their concepts of intellectual property from British common law before that. So it's really fundamentally a European concept. And we also view it as a fundamental driver of innovation, creativity. In the U.S., we have a little over 45 million jobs that depend directly on intellectual property, about a third of our GDP, almost 3/4 of our exports. So it's hard to overstate its importance to innovation, creativity, jobs, competitiveness, and to the business community at large. And as Cynthia also spoke to so well, it also is critical to protecting consumers, making sure they can make informed decisions about the purchases they make, et cetera, et cetera. To demonstrate this, I think we're still working on the slides, but okay, sure. Oh, no problem. So we produce each year a global intellectual property index. We started this in 2012, and there was no signature IP research project out there that took a look across the board and ranked different IP environments. So we started this project in 2012. And when we did, it caused a great deal of controversy. We were going to release it, and the Prime Minister of China was scheduled to visit Washington the next week, and they threatened to cancel his visit and all of that. And we released it anyway, and he ended up coming. But this product has grown over the years. We're now, you can skip forward a few slides. We now, this year, have just released it about 2 months ago. And we now take a look at 50 global economies that contribute a little bit over 90% of global GDP. And I have copies of this for anyone who's interested. And really, it's intended to be not a name and shame document. It's intended to be a tool for policymakers to understand what the business community is looking for when they make investment decisions in terms of the IP environment in a particular market. And we intend to grow this past 50 economies as well. Okay, thanks. Let's see. And so really, I'll wrap up because I know we need to get to questions, but we also, as part of this index, do a statistical analysis that has demonstrated a very clear correlation between countries that score higher on the index and increased social and economic benefits, things like R&D spending, economic competitiveness, innovative capacity, et cetera. And you can see some of that here. But with that, I know we've done a lot of talking, and we want to leave time for questions, so I'll turn it back to Barbara. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Jared. I think one thing that we all need to keep in mind, there is brands like famous cloth styles or things like that without naming them, or cars or wine or drinks or anything that we on purpose buy, and all of a sudden there wouldn't be any labels on them. Imagine that. One size fits all. Do we want that? I don't think we like that. So without that, Richard, the floor is yours again to run the show and the questions.
Yes, I think we have a microphone somewhere for... Okay, so... I see a first question there right away. Fantastic. Please state your name also and who the question is for.
Hyundai.
Thank you. My name is Gloria, and my question is for Cyntia. Since you talked about the tobacco industry and the dangers of non-branding, what about the rest of drugs, which are illegal, and the fact that because there's no branding, there are no enterprises, they don't have any regulations, they don't pay taxes. So if as a consumer, you consume something that you don't know who is producing it, with what poisons are they mixing it, including gasoline in cocaine or things like that, is there a debate in Europe, because in Latin America there is, of the importance of the dangers of not having brands, because as a consumer then you don't have anyone to rely.
Thank you, Gloria. It's a fantastic question. Actually, we do raise that a lot about the importance of why brands are reliability for consumers to know that a manufacturer stands behind it. And as you just mentioned, it has been proven that at least for tobacco products that are counterfeit, they have found an enormous amount of horrible things, from rat droppings to metals to everything. And the reality is we raise the point as an industry as well and mention it. But sometimes regulators kind of dismiss this point a little bit. And just not exactly that point, but just linking it also to this illegal sector and the importance of brands, I think an interesting debate that we have seen recently, it's about an industry sector that used to be illegal, that it's becoming legal through the use of branding, and an industry sector that was legal, or is legal, and it's actually forbidden from the use of branding. And a perfect example of this is Canada. So Canada has just passed the plain packaging regulation. But the fascinating thing about Canada is that whilst they would do it, on the same provisions, on the same law, they were actually granting the use of branding to cannabis, to recreational cannabis. So cannabis, the reason for this was, okay, we're going to make this sector legal to the use of branding, but at the same time, the legal sector, which was tobacco, well, now we are depriving you from the use of branding. So we see this dynamic, which is very interesting, of how they will play with the legality and how brands and the ownership of brands and the right to use a brand actually becomes a little bit into the knowledge of the regulators. We had the same initiative in Uruguay as well. They also just passed plain packaging, and they also have legal cannabis. At least in the case of Uruguay, they have mentioned in the parliamentary discussions, well, wait for it, we're going to do it for cannabis later as well. So it is a fantastic question because it does have a lot of repercussions when there is no use of branding, when there is no enforcement of the importance of IP rights, and also obviously this affects an increase on illegal trade. So yes, it is a challenging debate, but I think as well it's for society to raise these concerns and say, well, we need this information, we need these brands to also protect ourselves from this.
Thank you, Cynthia, but I must remind the panel, please keep your questions as precise, your answers as precise as possible. Thank you very much. The young man in the middle had a question there, Federico.
Thank you for being young. Thank you. My name is Federico. I have two questions, one for Cynthia and one for Jared. For Cynthia, a brief comment. What you described in a way is the total lack of accountability of the regulators, it seems. Because, I mean, if JTI tomorrow produces a cigarette that explodes when you turn it on, you would have lots of problems. But you can destroy basically an industry being a regulator. Are you thinking of ways to bring some accountability for regulators, because it will be a good service to society, not only to your industry? And the question for Jared, I totally agree with what you said, that IP is a driver for innovation and creativity. But on the other hand, are you concerned with, because I mean, one of the main criticisms is that IP can go too far. Then you have people, ice cream, tastes are, have a patent and you cannot call it the same, or things like that, or the round things on Mac that it can go, that can hinder innovation. I mean, that's a criticism at least. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think, it's for each country to determine their own IP laws, of course, but I think in the U.S., the business community generally feels that we've achieved a pretty good balance across the board and come up with a system that's appropriately balanced to encourage innovation and creativity. But of course, each country determines its own laws. We would certainly argue that stronger IP laws lead to more innovation, more creativity, and not hinder it.
Yes, I'll be very quick. So yes, I mean, the way we try to do it is through these better regulation principles, basically calling governments to adhere to these principles, do good analyses, good consultations, and hopefully if they actually do it, we will avoid this type of legislation.
We have very good translation here. Thank you very much, by the way. So if you would like to pose your question not in English, you're very free to do so. Do we have more questions in?
Yeah, there.
No.
Microphone.
Microphone? Nice.
Hello, my name is Anna, and I would like to ask you if there is a way to somehow protect your property without help of the government, like direct help, or with some organizations, like directly protect your property by yourself. Is there somehow a way? Thanks.
Registrar, central register.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for this question. I would, first of all, look back in history, and I mentioned Maria Theresia and the registry of land. that was put into that was implemented by her during the monarchy, and where this was centrally organized by the monarchy, by the government, more or less. So, and I also mentioned blockchain. Blockchain is nothing else as a modern technology where you can track and trace your property with the codes. And this is definitely a new way of how one could register your property. And some governments are already experimenting with this. Just Switzerland, and Richard probably knows more about it, in Zug, they made it kind of an idea to start experimenting on it. Will you comment on that? So there is an option. The question is, how far do we go? Do we set our minds and rethink certain things that we have been accustomed and used to for generations? And also, I would like to remind you that there are countries that had those registrations of property, and then all of a sudden you have a revolution and you are expropriated and you are lost and nothing is there. So peace, rule of law, I think, are a precondition to make sure that whether we do it on the private sector or whether we do it in a PPP model or whether we do it by government, that those things, that property rights are secured. So this is, I think, a precondition for everything.
Yes, I also believe that modern technology, whether it be the blockchain or other technologies, will contribute massively. I mean, you're all young and you have one of these things, and it's probably a major part of your life. I mean, in the old days, we would call a room and hope that somebody was there. Nowadays, we know where everybody is. This one has Face ID, that it knows its owner. I have lots of my data on here, and I can prove that it's me without all of these identification cards that I have to have. It's simplified. I mean, here in Europe, we do have these central registrars of property. In the United States, you don't. If you want to buy a house, you have to find the first guy that owned that property or bought it from the Indians or something, and then you need to prove one after another every contract until the present day. And I've been involved in buying ranches in Colorado. Alone, the property documentation filled this room with stacks and stacks and stacks, and it started out with a piece of paper of, Slim Jim with 3 X's bought this ranch, and it goes on for a few hundred years until today's property owners. That will all be simplified by the blockchain or by some other method of technology to be able to prove it. So we're living in exciting times where these things will change very rapidly. Next. Somebody in the back, please. Come on, don't be shy.
The gentleman.
In the corner there. We have the microphone.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Barbara a question. Don't you think that further we go with the new laws, the more we harm the national producers? Because they will need to adapt the new conditions. That's harmful for the economy.
Sorry, can you say again? I didn't quite understand what you meant.
Because don't you think that further we go with the new laws, we more harm the national producers?
Well, the good thing about laws and regulation is that sometimes it takes too long to pass those things, and industry and producers are faster in adapting and being creative and finding new things. But again, protection also of local producers is important. But, again, they need to understand that they compete We are living in a globalized world. We're not living in islands that are secured. The former G7 or G8 is not like the one that we see now. It's not Great Britain, France, Germany against each other and against the US and others. It's probably one Europe against other parts of the world competing. But still, I think that it is important to keep up those regional brands and that to support those regional brands because they are part of the identity, part of the tradition of a country. And I think those are things that make the roots or the values of a society. They underpin that. So national brands or local brands, I would not call it national brands, but local brands or regional brands are very important, and we need to make sure that those are protected.
Thank you.
Yes, since Moldova is very famous for its fruit, I'll use a fruit example. Austria in the Wachau sells apricot brandy and apricot marmalade. And funnily enough, the Austrian word for apricot is different than the German word for apricot. So when we joined the EU, it was a major discussion whether we got to keep our word for apricot rather than having to use the German word for apricot. And I don't know, your fruits are so fantastic. I would definitely use branding for Moldovan fruits to strengthen your own property rights. Okay, we have time for one more question before I close the floor. So, anybody else? Looks to me like everybody wants to go to coffee break. Yes, I don't blame you. As a Viennese, I need all the coffee I can get in the morning. So thank everyone for attending, and we reconvene at 11:30. Thank you very much.